and thanks to you at home for joining us this hour. A few months ago, in the summer of 2018, a guy you've probably never heard of got a subpoena. His name is Andrew Miller. He is not a famous person. In the 2016 presidential campaign, for a time, he worked for Roger Stone. And because of that affiliation with Roger Stone, Andrew Miller, last year, got a subpoena. He was subpoenaed to hand over documents and communications that he had related to Roger Stone. Roger Stone and WikiLeaks and the DNC and the stuff that was stolen from the Democratic Party and the Clinton campaign by Russian government hackers. Andrew Miller complied with that request for documents and communications. He did hand stuff over to the FBI. But when he was also subpoenaed to testify about those same matters, to come to Washington, D.C. and testify in person to the grand jury convened by the special counsel, to that subpoena, Andrew Miller said no. And the reason anybody has paid any attention to Andrew Miller's case since then is because his no, his refusal to testify to the grand jury, that has become a legal vehicle for conservative legal groups who are using Mr. Miller's case as a way to try to attack and derail the special counsel's investigation overall. Andrew Miller saying no to that subpoena, him subsequently being held in contempt of court, him risking jail time for refusing to testify to the grand jury, that is the way some conservative legal groups are trying to challenge the constitutionality of Mueller's investigation. His case is the way, specifically, they are trying to get the Mueller investigation before the U.S. Supreme Court, because they hope they might, before the Supreme Court, have a chance of nullifying the whole Russia investigation. They hope they might be able to get Mueller's appointment thrown out, and they are trying to press those constitutional questions about the appointment of Robert Mueller and the conduct of this investigation using Andrew Miller's little case. And that's why anybody has been interested at all in this one little offshoot of the Russia investigation and the special counsel's work. This part, again, that relates to a guy you've never heard of, who's called Andrew Miller. And his role, the fact that his case was being sort of used as a vehicle to challenge the constitutionality of Mueller's office, that was really the only reason to be interested in his part of the case at all, until now. As you know, President Trump's longtime friend and longtime political advisor, Roger Stone, he was indicted a few days ago. Mr. Stone was arrested in South Florida at his home. He had his first court appearance in federal court in Florida on Friday. But Mr. Stone is being charged in federal court in Washington, D.C. And so today was the day he was actually arraigned on these 7 felony charges that he's facing. And he was arraigned in the court where he will go on trial in D.C. As a legal matter, Roger Stone's arraignment today was straightforward. It was formal. There had been a little comedy of errors over the last 24 hours around his legal counsel. Neither of the lawyers who are representing him are admitted to the bar in Washington, D.C., and they didn't submit the proper paperwork to the court so that they could legally represent Roger Stone at this arraignment today. We learned about that when the court dinged them for it yesterday and said, hey, you need to get your paperwork in. They screwed that up with the court a couple of different ways yesterday on the eve of the arraignment. Then this morning, they blew through the court-imposed deadline. They were an hour and a half late in finally submitting their paperwork to the court, which would allow them to represent their client. So it has not been an auspicious beginning for Roger Stone's legal team in terms of the way they're screwing up even the basic question of whether they're allowed to represent him, just getting that basic paperwork in. When it came to the actual arraignment today, though, it was fairly straightforward. They waived the actual reading of the indictment. The prosecution side of the aisle included both attorneys from the U.S. Attorney's Office in D.C. and attorneys from Robert Mueller's office, the special counsel's office. Jeannie Rhee, one of the prosecutors who works for Mueller, explained to the judge today that Mueller's team and the D.C. U.S. attorney, they will be jointly trying this case against Roger Stone. So that was interesting. That was sort of the most interesting thing that happened today in court. On the defense side, Roger Stone's defense lawyers entered a plea of not guilty on his behalf to the 7 felony charges. Unless that changes, that will mean that we should expect there will be a criminal trial for Roger Stone on these 7 felony charges. Now, we don't know when exactly that would happen if his case does, in fact, proceed to trial. We do know that Roger Stone will be back in court again on Friday of this week for what they call a status hearing. So all of that sort of proceeded the way it should have today. It was a fairly formal thing. But here's this great detail about Andrew Miller, right? This otherwise obscure figure in this little part of the Russia investigation who we haven't been paying too much attention to up until this point. And I want to credit two CNN reporters for this. Sarah Murray and Caitlin Polantz at CNN are the ones who recognized this thread and pulled on it with Andrew Miller's defense lawyer. Because it turns out, under Justice Department rules, once a grand jury has indicted somebody, that grand jury is not allowed to keep collecting more evidence randomly about that person who they've already brought an indictment against, right? Grand juries serve a specific purpose. Prosecutors give evidence and witness testimony to a grand jury. The grand jury then deliberates on that evidence and decides whether or not that evidence is enough to bring charges against someone, to bring an indictment against a defendant. But then that's it. I mean, once that is done, once an indictment is brought on the say-so of the grand jury's role is over when it comes to that defendant. That's the way it works in terms of how grand juries get used. So in the case of Roger Stone, the indictment that was unsealed last week, that resulted in him getting arrested, that resulted in him getting arraigned today. That indictment against Roger Stone, that was approved by a grand jury, and once that grand jury signed off on the indictment of Roger Stone, technically, that grand jury should be done with anything having to do with Roger Stone. They served their purpose. The Roger Stone evidence that they heard resulted in a Roger Stone indictment. They're done. I mean, grand juries are a tool that prosecutors use for a specific thing. They evaluate evidence and testimony to decide whether or not it adds up to enough to justify an indictment. After the indictment against a defendant, there's no reason for that grand jury to hear anything else related to that defendant. And here's the really interesting part. Remember, this guy, Andrew Miller, the sort of obscure guy who is fighting this subpoena, what he was asked about, what his subpoena is about, is information that Mr. Miller allegedly had that pertains to Roger Stone and Roger Stone's contact with WikiLeaks and the information that the Russian government stole from the Democratic Party and the Clinton campaign during the presidential election of 2016. That's what he was subpoenaed about. All of that stuff was in the Roger Stone indictment, right? Roger Stone is charged with 7 felony counts for lying to Congress about his contact with WikiLeaks and for trying to persuade another witness to lie to Congress or to not testify to Congress on these same issues pertaining to WikiLeaks trafficking the information that Russia stole from the Democrats and from the Clinton campaign. All that stuff that Miller was asked about, that's the stuff that ended up in the Stone indictment. So when that indictment was filed against Roger Stone, the lawyer, who is the defense lawyer for this guy, Andrew Miller, he had reason to believe, well, okay, they've indicted Roger Stone now. That's what they wanted to ask my client about. That must mean this whole thing involving my client is done. Because clearly the grand jury is done here, and they did it without my client's testimony. They wanted my client to testify about Roger Stone and WikiLeaks. Well, Roger Stone and WikiLeaks indictment is done and dusted. Roger Stone, we all saw him, got arrested. He's in court. It's done. The grand jury can't keep collecting more evidence about that defendant if the indicting part of their job is done here, right? So, hey, Andrew Miller's off the hook, right? No. It turns out he's not. Oh, really? Tell me more. Sarah Murray and Caitlin Polantz at CNN report that Andrew Miller's lawyer, his defense lawyer, contacted the special counsel's office after Roger Stone got indicted to ask whether Andrew Miller would still be needed, whether they would still want him to testify before the grand jury. And according to CNN, the special counsel's office told Andrew Miller's attorney, actually, yeah, we still want your client's testimony before this grand jury. Andrew Miller's defense lawyer says the special counsel's office told him that they consider this, quote, still a live case. Well, all grand juries do is indict people. So if they've got a live case, that means, I mean, if the grand jury is still working on this, still taking more testimony on this after Roger Stone has already been indicted, if this is still a live case before that grand jury, that means they're still working on another potential indictment related to Roger Stone and WikiLeaks and what Russia stole from the Democrats. And it could mean that it's just that Roger Stone is going to get indicted again, right? It could just be more indictments for him. There could be some potential superseding indictment coming for Roger Stone on top of the 7 felony counts he's already looking at. It could be that. That could be the next indictment, the next potential indictment they're working toward. But it could also mean that somebody else is potentially looking at getting indicted by the same grand jury. An indictment that would derive, at least in part, from the same general set of facts concerning Roger Stone and his contact with WikiLeaks and the information that was stolen by the Russian government from the Democrats. Because that's what Andrew Miller has been asked about. That's what he supposedly needs to tell the grand jury about, which means the grand jury is still working on that. This little Andrew Miller case has always been a weird outlier in the Russia scandal. But what that case has just taught us is that in all likelihood, Roger Stone does not stand alone, or at least this Roger Stone indictment does not stand alone. There is something else that grand jury is working on. There is something else, meaning another indictment that may be coming from this same grand jury that relates to the same basic set of facts. Now, grand jury proceedings are secret, and the secrecy of the grand jury is a serious thing. We do not know more about what's going on before that grand jury than we can glean from circumstantial evidence like this. Right, in terms of what exactly they're considering or what they might do next. But because of something that happened here on this show live last night, I feel like it would be, I would be remiss not to note that the one other person associated with the Trump campaign, besides Roger Stone, who admits to having months of communication with WikiLeaks during the campaign, including specifically communications about what kind of anti-Hillary Clinton information WikiLeaks might be dropping during the campaign that might help Donald Trump's chances at winning. The only other person besides Roger Stone we know of who had those months of communications with WikiLeaks is this man, the president's eldest son and namesake, Donald Trump Jr. His repeated messages with WikiLeaks were obtained by reporter Julia Ioffe at The Atlantic magazine. She reported at the time that messages between Donald Trump Jr. and WikiLeaks were also turned over to congressional investigators. These communications between Donald Trump Jr. and WikiLeaks reportedly started during the presidential campaign and continued after the election and after the inauguration until at least mid-summer 2017. Which would be long after even Trump's handpicked CIA director, Mike Pompeo, was publicly describing WikiLeaks as a hostile intelligence service that has, quote, often abetted state actors like Russia. Donald Trump Jr. was still communicating directly with WikiLeaks even after those kinds of public claims about Mike Pompeo, even after everything we learned about how WikiLeaks worked with the Russian government to help them interfere in our election during 2016. Now, we know that at least 2 of the 3 congressional committees that Donald Trump Jr. testified before, asked him detailed questions about his interactions with WikiLeaks. We know that he was asked detailed questions about his communications with WikiLeaks in the Senate Judiciary Committee because that testimony was released publicly, so we can see that transcript of that testimony. The Washington Post also reported that Donald Trump Jr.'s communications with WikiLeaks were the subject of extensive discussion when he also testified behind closed doors to the House Intelligence Committee. Now, that transcript we don't have. That was closed-door testimony. And we do not know if Donald Trump Jr. got himself into any sort of trouble in terms of false statements when it came to his testimony before any of these committees, on WikiLeaks or on anything. But we do know that Roger Stone has just been indicted for lying to Congress about his contacts with WikiLeaks. And it appears that the grand jury that indicted Roger Stone for those 7 felony counts is still at work and still taking evidence towards some potential future indictment that touches on those same basic sets of facts. And, again, I feel I would be remiss to not point out that there is now a long trail of fairly insistent claims from multiple members of Congress on multiple committees in Congress that there were, in fact, problems with the testimony of Donald Trump Jr. And if we are now at the part of the Mueller investigation and the Russia investigation where people are going to be charged for lying to Congress now, like we've seen with Cohen and like we've seen with Stone, members of Congress are telling us now insistently that if there's anybody who should be worried about that, anybody of all the people who testified before them, really, it's the president's eldest son who should be most worried. This, for example, was Senator Richard Blumenthal, who's on the Senate Judiciary Committee, here on this show last night.
But I can tell you this much. I was in the room when a great many of these witnesses appeared before the Senate Judiciary Committee behind closed doors. I think many of them should be called back to testify in public, and I hope that will be true of other congressional committees as well, because behind closed doors, there arose, in my mind, very clearly, questions, serious issues concerning their truthfulness. And that issue pertained particularly to Donald Trump Jr. in a number of his contentions before our committee. So I think this common thread of lying to Congress, and particularly to congressional committees, may ensnare a number of other potential targets in the special counsel's investigation and become a matter of criminal action.
Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut speaking here on this show last night. Now, I did not ask him a question about Donald Trump Jr. I asked Senator Blumenthal whether the special counsel had reviewed testimony from anybody else who was a witness before his committee, anybody else who the senator perceives might now be in trouble for lying to Congress, now that Michael Cohen has been charged for lying to Congress, now that Roger Stone has been charged with lying to Congress. And Senator Blumenthal volunteered, yeah, Donald Trump Jr. is the one named person who should really think about having something to worry about on that score. And this is not the first time that a member of Congress has suggested that after hearing testimony from Donald Trump Jr., meaning these are not just people throwing that out there because they have feelings about Donald Trump Jr. They're people who are in a position to know because they heard his testimony. In May, for example, Senator Chris Coons of Delaware sent a letter to the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, then Chuck Grassley, saying that he believed Donald Trump Jr. may have lied in his Judiciary Committee testimony about contacts with another cooperating witness in the Mueller investigation, a mysterious character named George Nader, who was reportedly representing Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates at the time he was meeting with people from the Trump campaign and the Trump transition. Senator Coons explicitly raising the prospect that Donald Trump Jr. lied under oath in his Judiciary Committee testimony about those contacts. Then, when Michael Cohen pled guilty in late November to lying to the House Intelligence Committee about his work on Trump Tower Moscow and the contacts that project entailed between him and officials at the Kremlin, a member of the House Intelligence Committee, Jim Himes, congressman from Connecticut, came on this show and said, well, he couldn't comment on the specifics of closed-door testimony before that committee. He said other people who testified to the committee about Trump Tower Moscow testified in a way that was effectively congruent with what Michael Cohen had told them under oath. That becomes a problem when Michael Cohen then admits that his story to that committee was a lie. He pled guilty to a felony for giving false testimony to that committee about Trump Tower Moscow. Anybody else who gave congruent testimony on Trump Tower Moscow may presumably also have lied to that committee in the same way that Cohen admits he did. And now today, this afternoon on MSNBC, California Congresswoman Jackie Speier, who's a veteran member of the Intelligence Committee, she was speaking with Katie Tur on our air here this afternoon, and she put a very fine point on it.
Are you concerned that anybody else lied to your committee?
I am concerned that other people lied to the committee, and I wouldn't be surprised if we find out through the Mueller investigation and report that he has identified others.
Who potentially do you think could have lied?
Well, I'm not going to go there with you right at the moment, but I think you could probably figure out people within the Trump organization who testified before our committee.
The Trump organization is the Trump business, and not that many people from the Trump organization have testified before that committee, the House Intelligence Committee, at least that we know of. One of them is Michael Cohen, who has now pled guilty to lying to the committee. Another one is Donald Trump Jr., who, again, we know was asked at least about his WikiLeaks contacts before that committee. He was also asked about the Trump Tower Moscow project by that committee. There are now two other people who are charged with felonies now for lying to Congress about those two issues, about WikiLeaks and about Trump Tower Moscow. What are the odds that the president's eldest son might be in the same kind of pickle based on the testimony that he gave under oath? So we're going to speak with Congresswoman Jackie Speier a little bit later on this hour. We will get a chance to ask her about that. But if the president's eldest son is in a legal pickle here, there's a couple things to consider. One is that we really don't know how the president himself might react to that kind of legal jeopardy for an immediate family member, for his namesake and eldest son. Just in terms of the human psychology here about the president and his defense and what he sees as a red line or something that may provoke him to do things he hasn't otherwise done. If his eldest son is in legal jeopardy here, we just don't know what to expect from the president on that front. Also, you should know that there's a little bit of a logistical hurdle that Republicans in Congress have thrown up in terms of how this may proceed. And this pertains to Donald Trump Jr. potentially being in trouble because of his testimony. It also may affect other witnesses who are in the same kind of potential jeopardy. One of the things we've been reporting on for the past few days is the fact that although the new Congress is in session and committees are holding hearings and votes are happening, the Republicans have not yet announced which members of Congress they're going to put on the Intelligence Committee. They've announced the membership for like 23 other committees, but not Intelligence. Well, if the special counsel, Robert Mueller, and his grand jury do have an interest in looking at certified transcripts of the testimony of Donald Trump Jr. or any other witnesses before the House Intelligence Committee, the special counsel's office can only bring legal action on the basis of someone's potentially false testimony if they have an official transcript of that testimony. And they can only get an official transcript of that testimony once the Intelligence Committee meets and votes to release that official transcript. Votes that the transcript can be transmitted to the special counsel. That closed-door testimony, the transcripts thereof, that's property of the committee, and the committee has to vote to release it before the special counsel can get it, and the special counsel needs an official transcript before they can take any legal action on that basis. Well, the committee can't meet to take a vote to release anyone's transcript until they have all their members, right? Until the membership of the committee is set. And so far, Republicans won't appoint their members. And so nothing can happen on the Intelligence Committee whatsoever. Now, we reported on that apparent delay last week. The Republican House leader, Kevin McCarthy, was asked about it on Meet the Press this weekend. He said it was just basically a logistical snafu. It was communication problems in terms of when the House Speaker's election. He said the Republican members would be named very soon. Definitely this week. We've been through Monday. We've now been through Tuesday. Those members still have not been named. Congressman Adam Schiff has said that the first order of business, once his committee is formally convened, is that the very first thing they will do is they will vote to send these transcripts over to Robert Mueller for his review. But it'll take about 3 days after they take the vote. And tick-tock, they can't even take the vote yet. So far, they cannot get anywhere near that first order of business while Republicans continue to delay seating their members. So if Donald Trump Jr. or anybody else who testified to House Intelligence is potentially in legal trouble for having lied to that committee, the way that Roger Stone is now in legal trouble, the way that Michael Cohen is now in legal trouble, House Republicans are effectively protecting those witnesses as long as they don't seat their members on that committee, so that committee cannot release its official transcripts. I don't know how long House Republicans can keep that up, but they're stretching it already. More ahead. Stay with us.